Back on the record, this is the people of the state of Colorado versus James Egan Holmes, case number 12CR1522. The record should reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. We are outside the presence of the jury, and juror 901 is telling us that she's ready to go, so we can proceed. Let's bring the jury in, please. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has joined us again. Members of the jury, I want to remind you that the court has admitted the testimony of Dr. Metzner for a limited purpose. You may consider his testimony only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Dr. Metzner, I remind you that you're still under oath. And Mr. King, you may resume your cross-examination of Dr. Metzner.
Thank you, Judge. Doctor, after reviewing all the material and talking to all the relevant people and interviewing Mr. Holmes, you eventually reached a diagnosis, and I realize I may be taking one step back, but is that correct?
Well, as I previously testified, I reached a differential diagnosis, and of that differential diagnosis, I said what I thought was the most likely diagnosis.
And part of the differential diagnosis was schizophrenia, as well as schizoaffective disorder, as well as a major depressive disorder. Is that right?
Correct.
And the diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, in essence, is you just testified before the break, essentially a combination of a major depressive disorder and schizophrenia, correct?
Well, it's a combination, correct, although you could have either a major depressive disorder or you could have a manic episode.
So, in that sense, well, why don't you tell the jury what an exclusionary diagnosis is first?
Well, an exclusionary diagnosis, if you look at DSM-5, to give a particular diagnosis of, say, of schizophrenia. There's what's called A criteria, in capital A criteria, and there's about five different symptoms in which you got to meet at least 2 of 5. And then there'll be B criteria, and B criteria, I think in DSM-5 for schizophrenia, has to do with impairments, and or time duration. And then there'll be another, whether it's C criteria or D criteria, it will say, for example, if you have the following, then that will exclude the diagnosis of schizophrenia. So when you talk about exclusion criteria, it means if you meet certain criteria, then that diagnosis is impossible. It has to be some other diagnosis.
For example, if you diagnose schizoaffective disorder, it excludes schizophrenia as a matter of course. Is that right?
That's right. A better example probably is, say you meet all the A criteria of schizophrenia, which is essentially showing psychotic symptoms, but it turns out that the reason you had those symptoms is because you took amphetamines and you had an amphetamine psychosis, which can look just like schizophrenia. But if you know that that psychosis was caused by amphetamines, then that would exclude the diagnosis of schizophrenia.
No indication, suffice it to say, that Mr. Holmes' psychosis was caused by any drug or alcohol or anything along those lines.
No, this was not related to substance use or abuse.
And why is it important to reach a diagnosis?
Well, it depends on the context. In this context, it's, in my mind, it's more important to reach a differential diagnosis than a diagnosis, because what you have to reach in a sanity evaluation is the first question: did he have a mental disease or defect at the time of the alleged crimes? So you got to answer that question. As I said in direct, I don't think it makes much of a difference whether it's schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder.
And I want to talk to you about that as well. But before we get there, you said that you were involved in writing the cautionary statement for forensic use of the DSM-4. Is that right?
Not exactly. What I said is I reminded the jury that what's called the cautionary statement or the forensic caveat in DSM-4. I wasn't involved in writing that, but related to that, part of the process of both DSM-4 and DSM-5 is once there were drafts of all the chapters, they did several things. They say, for example, the draft on schizophrenia. They would have sent, there's a council of the APA that is specific on schizophrenia. So they would have sent that draft to the council on schizophrenia to make sure there's nothing wrong in there. And they would have also sent that draft to experts around the country. In fact, you were invited if you wanted to comment on that. In addition to that, they sent all the chapters to the Council on Psychiatry and Law, of which I was a member at the time. And the question was, is there anything in here in the text or the criteria that's inconsistent with the cautionary statement? And I was specifically reviewed the chapter on schizophrenia.
Okay. And I don't know if you recall you said you saw Dr. Reed's testimony, is that right?
Correct.
During Dr. Reed's testimony, Dr. Reed was asked to read paragraphs 1 and 3 of the cautionary statement for forensic use of the DSM-5. What I would like to do is read you a quotation, and if you want to take a look, you're more than welcome to. Just let me know. I'd like to read you a quotation or two from paragraph 2 of that document and see if you have any commentary on that.
Overruled.
When used appropriately, diagnosis and diagnostic information can assist legal decision makers in their determinations. For example, when the presence of a mental disorder is the predicate for a subsequent legal determination, the use of an established system of diagnosis enhances the value and the reliability of the determination. Can you explain that statement to the jury?
Yes, what that basically means is, for example, I had to determine whether Mr. Holmes suffered from a mental disease or defect at the time of the commission of the alleged acts. This cautionary statement, the second paragraph, basically says the DSM-5 can be very helpful in determining whether someone has a mental disease or defect that because it has a common language. So it's not my making up a mental disorder that I think this is a mental disorder. I can say he meets the criteria for either this diagnosis or that diagnosis, and my understanding of those diagnoses that they meet the definition of mental disease or defect within the statute.
And I think that's what you're saying is I'm going to read one more sentence from this paragraph, if I might. The literature related to diagnosis also serves as a check on ungrounded speculation about mental disorders and about the functioning of a particular individual. Is that what you were saying, in part?
Yes, that's what I was saying.
And the way that that relates to the sanity determination is that the type of diagnosis that a person has is relevant to determining what their thought processes might be during the time of the offense. Fair to say?
In general, it's fair to say, and why I say that is you could have a diagnosis, say, of an anxiety disorder, and an anxiety disorder isn't associated with psychotic features. So if the only diagnosis he had was an anxiety disorder, it would not be very credible by an expert to say, as a result of this anxiety disorder, he experienced delusional thinking. Now, so it's correct in that sense. It's also, where it's somewhat not correct is you could have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. That doesn't mean because you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia that you were psychotic at any particular time, but it does mean if an expert found someone to be psychotic at a particular time and found them to have schizophrenia, that would be each would be consistent with each other.
And certainly you're aware that the test, and you've said this a number of times, the test in Colorado for whether someone meets the standard for legal insanity or not has to turn on what the person's mental state is at the time of the offense, correct?
Correct.
So what we're doing in a lot of situations when we're trying to determine capacity, because we can never be inside the person's brain at the time of the offense, fair to say?
Correct.
So we're never going to know with 100% certainty what that person was actually thinking at the time, correct?
Correct.
The best that we can ever do is to logically infer what might have been the thought process that the person was engaging in at the time, based upon what they say later, what they said before, or any other relevant information around the event.
Well, I would emphasize the inference is based on that kind of information. The inference is not based on the diagnosis alone.
Correct, correct. And I'm not suggesting that it is. But the inference would be based on other information considered in light of the diagnosis. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
In other words, you consider the information. If you've said that Mr. Holmes was psychotic at the time of the incident, so part of the analysis is analyzing how that mental illness affected his thought process at the time and whether there was logical thinking going on there or not.
Correct.
Now, I want to talk about schizophrenia and what the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia are. And can I have 2623 shown to the court and to the witness, please? Do you recognize what I put up on the screen, sir?
I do. This is the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia from DSM-5.
Would that help to explain to the jury what these criteria are to actually be able to go through these?
Would not hurt.
Explain to me what criteria A is, and if we could highlight criteria A, please. Is this the psychotic symptoms part of the diagnosis of schizophrenia?
That's correct.
So, and what this requires is that you have 2 or more of the following, each present for a significant period of time during a 1-month period. Is that fair, sir?
Yes.
In Mr. Holmes' case, you found that he met this criteria in the sense that he had delusions, correct?
Correct.
And negative symptoms, correct?
Correct. And I guess I'm assuming you're asking me July 20 or before. You're not asking me through any other time.
Right. Well, let's clear that up. Certainly, as of November 2012, he experienced hallucinations as well. Fair to say?
And a disorganized speech at that time as well.
And but I'm talking about as of the July 2012.
Okay.
You have identified delusions.
Correct.
And negative symptoms, correct?
Correct.
And those are symptoms of psychosis, is that correct?
Yes.
Especially the delusions.
Correct.
If you have a delusion, you are by definition psychotic, correct?
That is correct.
And your opinion that Mr. Holmes' idea regarding human capital is a delusion, how strongly do you hold that opinion?
Within a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Now, if we can look at B, please. Can you explain criteria B for us, sir?
Yes, this goes to what I talked before about functional impairments. And it says, essentially, prior to the onset of the psychosis, or around the time of the psychosis, but prior to the onset of the psychosis, that there are significant functional impairments in either interpersonal relationships, self-care, or work. And so that's what it says.
And in Mr. Holmes' case, you indicated in your report that there were significant levels of disturbance in functioning in several areas, including work and interpersonal relationships. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, the breakup with Gargi, for example, in your opinion, the breakup with Gargi didn't cause the shooting directly. In other words, the reason for the shooting was not the breakup with Gargi. The breakup with Gargi was a trigger to the psychosis, which then created the delusion, which would cause the shooting to take place.
I think was one of several triggers. It wasn't the trigger.
Understood. Another trigger would have been failure in academic failure.
At that point, I wouldn't say academic failure. It was not doing well in school. It eventually was academic failure, but not doing as well in school as he had done before, particularly in presentations.
Now, that didn't cause the shooting, correct?
That's correct.
That was a trigger for the psychosis that caused the shooting, correct?
In my opinion.
Now, in your opinion, Mr. Holmes had these negative symptoms, this prodromal period, or what you describe as schizotypal personality disorder, for some time before the onset of the psychosis, before the delusion actually developed. Is that right?
Yes. So if I can, I'd like to go back and just say something about the triggers.
Sure.
The question about, he had chronic homicidal thinking for many years. And so one of the questions I had to answer is, okay, why is he acting on them now? And why did he develop delusional thinking? And there's several possibilities. One possibility, it had nothing to do with triggers. if you look at the onset of schizophrenia in males, the most frequent onset of schizophrenia is in your 20s. And so it could have had nothing to do with any triggers. It could have just been the natural course of his illness, and that's why he became psychotic then. On the other hand, it's very common to see someone who has the underlying genetic predisposition to schizophrenia to have their first psychosis triggered by stress. And as I got the history, I identified 3 major areas of stress that I've testified to that I thought triggered. And so that's why I think that precipitated his psychosis. But I could be wrong on that, and it could have nothing to do with triggers, and it could have just been the natural course of his illness.
And the natural course of schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder is just as you say, that quite often the onset of the psychosis aspect of it happens when people, especially young men, are in their early 20s. Is that right?
Right. It's like hypertension. You could be predisposed to have hypertension, and some people get it when the genes kick in, and other people get it sooner before the genes kick in because they're under a tremendous amount of stress.
Or they're smoking 5 packs of cigarettes a day. Or
yes.
The and there's no doubt, is there, in your mind, that Mr. Holmes was genetically loaded for mental illness, right?
Yes, that's based on his father's fraternal sister, his aunt, has schizoaffective disorder. His mother's father, his maternal grandfather, had a psychotic illness and had hospitalizations, and his father's father had severe obsessive compulsive disorder that was disabling and was also psychiatrically hospitalized. And there's also little question that there's a genetic component to schizophrenia. It doesn't mean if you have a family history of schizophrenia that you're going to get schizophrenia, but you're more likely to get schizophrenia if you have a family history, just like if you have a family history of heart disease. You're more likely to get it. Doesn't mean you're going to get it.
And that was going to be my next question, is that an apt analogy between hypertension and schizophrenia in the sense that it's a risk factor, but it doesn't mean you're automatically going to get it? Fair to say?
That's fair to say.
And some people get hypertension. They don't smoke cigarettes. They don't have bad life choices. They just get it genetically. It just happens despite all of their good intentions and healthy living.
Yes, you could have no family history of schizophrenia and still get schizophrenia.
Now, can we go to C, please? This is a continuous signs of the disturbance persist for at least 6 months. And it has to include at least 1 month of symptoms that meet criterion A, and may also include periods of prodromal or residual symptoms. During these prodromal or residual periods, the signs of the disturbance may be manifested by only negative symptoms, or by 1 or 2 or more of the symptoms listed in criterion A in an attenuated form. Can you explain that, please?
Yes. So it essentially says you have to have the active symptoms untreated for at least a month, and the active symptoms he had was the delusion and the negative symptoms. And then in addition to that, you have to have at least 6 months of, it's really pre-psychotic symptoms, prodromal symptoms. And he clearly had for a long time the negative symptoms. You saw that back in, I think the jury's heard the evidence that the application, I think, is to the University of Iowa, in which the admissions people said Mr. Holmes had, from a paper review of his academic credentials, he was a shoo-in. But they interviewed him and thought that he interacted in a very aloof, bizarre way. That was an example of some of his negative symptoms.
And it's your opinion that those negative symptoms onset even previous to that. Is that right? How far back do they go?
Well, I think you can start seeing it back in his college days.
Okay. Those negative symptoms, we went through some of those with the jury, but those include alogia, which is a paucity of speech. Is that right?
Yes.
Asociality, not interested in being around other people.
Correct.
Avolition, lack of motivation, correct?
Yes.
Anhedonia, inability to get pleasure out of things that are normally pleasurable.
Correct.
Now, this jury has heard some talk about how Mr. Holmes, in his graduate program, appeared, number one, to have a paucity of speech. You recall reading reports about that, about how he didn't talk very much?
Yes.
That's consistent with the negative symptom of schizophrenia, correct?
Yes.
And it's consistent with what you observed in Mr. Holmes, is that correct?
Yes.
You've also heard about a lack of motivation from some of these folks. Thought that he just didn't appear to be that into it and didn't seem to be trying that hard. That would be consistent with the negative symptoms of schizophrenia too, is that right?
Correct.
Now, you said that when you were asked by Mr. Brockler about studying for these prelims, that Mr. Holmes indicated that he didn't study very much for his prelims in the spring of 2012. Is that right?
Yes.
And he indicated to you that that was out of the ordinary, in that previously he'd studied very hard and had to try very hard and study very hard in order to succeed academically like he had, correct?
Correct.
No indication that he just had it so easy through his entire academic career that he never had to study at all and was unmotivated the entire time, but it just was so easy for him to do that when he reached graduate school, it was just too hard for him. That's not what he told you, is it?
What he told me is what a large part of what motivated his studying in the past was fear of not doing well and of not pleasing people. And so that was, and so he decided this time he's going to be himself and not let it be due to fear.
Okay. When, in your opinion, did Mr. Holmes become psychotic? Was it that the first real sign for you, that Gmail chat with Gargi on the 25th of March, 2012?
That's the first time that I had concrete evidence.
Now, is psychosis or these delusions the type of thing where you go to sleep one night and you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden you've got a full-blown delusion and you're just psychotic? Or does normally it involve a more fluid process?
I think it's a more fluid process, unless, and where I would say it may be very abrupt. You can become delusional based on certain medical illnesses or certain insults to your brain. So, and for example of that, you saw a different kind of delusion in Mr. Holmes is when in November, when he stopped eating, because at that point he thought his food was being poisoned, and he developed a delirium. And when you develop a delirium, that's usually very acute onset, and you can develop a delusion that you didn't have the day before. So, in those kinds of causes of delusion, it can be overnight. The kind of delusion related to schizophrenia is usually not one day you're delusional and the next day one day you're not delusional and the next day that you are.
And you don't think that happened to Mr. Holmes? You think that this was a more of a gradual process, a fluid process that happened over time. Is that right? And So over time, the delusion gains in strength, or how does that work? Or does it wax and wane, where it may be worse and then get better? Or explain that to us.
Well, like a lot of things, it depends. And I don't think it's a matter of being able to measure the strength of the delusion. I think, one, it depends on the content of the delusion, and it depends on the environmental circumstances. So if you have a delusion, for example, that people over 6 feet tall are going to harm you, it's probably going to be much more intense if you're in a room with a bunch of people over 6 feet tall. And if you're not in a room, that may not be such a important thing at that time. So it really depends.
Okay. Would you agree with me that the psychotic process can wax and wane over time, that folks can have bad days and bad months and do better at times? Is that fair to say?
Yes, and a good example of that is one example of a psychotic symptom is auditory hallucinations. There's some people who hear auditory hallucinations every day, but there's plenty of people once a week they hear them, or during the day they don't hear it constantly. So that's a waxing and waning.
Is that part of the reason that it's important to try as best we can to focus on what the mental state of the individual was on the date of offense to determine what the process was that was going on at that time? Does that make sense, my question, or no?
Yes, it does. And that's one reason for doing that.
So is it your opinion that what happened to Mr. Holmes in November of 2012 is somehow a different disease or a different psychosis than what was going on in July of 2012? Or is it part of the same disease displaying different symptoms at different times?
The opinion I gave is that Mr. Holmes, prior to July 20, and including July 20, that his predominant psychotic symptom was this delusion. And I think the delusion that he had on July 20 was the same delusion that he had, that was evidenced in the March 25 Gmail chat. And when you read his notebook and you read the first couple pages, that if you just try to read, it makes no sense. But when you talk with him and try to make sense of it, he had that in June and July as well, as evidenced by his notebook.
And how about in August, how about the writings that he wrote in the jail about the galactic colonization and the ultraception that he describes in there, and those writings?
Well, what I can say about the writings, about those writings, is I got those writings after my examination, and I got them after my examination because because they weren't available. No one was aware of those writings. If you just read them, I think they're pretty bizarre. But I didn't talk to him about that. So what they mean and whether it's the same process or a different process, I don't know.
Now, you did say before that you were able to read the notebook and go through the notebook with him, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that, well, there are different parts of the notebook. There's the planning kind of part where he talks about the theater, correct?
Yes.
And to some extent, that seems to have some logic to it. In other words, because it seems to be logically evaluating different options and things like that. Would you agree with that?
I think it's very logical in the context of wanting to carry out an illogical, rational belief.
Now, on the other hand, the other part of the notebook that involves all those equations of ones and zeros and diagrams, and that is really nonsensical. Wouldn't you agree with me?
On its surface, I would agree that it's nonsensical, and not just nonsensical, I think it's psychotic. And that's why when I tried to understand from him what this all meant. I got enough understanding that it was related to this delusional belief, but I can't explain his thinking about that. And I think that's also similar to what you see in the Gmail chat, in which he's talking with Gargi, and she's trying to argue with him about, why would you want to do this? It doesn't make sense. And she finally says, I don't understand what you're talking about. And I think she didn't understand what he was talking about because it was psychotic.
And that's in March again, is that right?
Correct.
Now, he wrote in the notebook after he stopped going to treatment on June 11th, 2012. Is that right?
Correct.
So sometime in that 3 or 4 week period, maybe more, he wrote what was in the notebook and then mailed that to Dr. Fenton.
Correct.
And he said that he did it so that psychiatrists could treat people like him effectively. Correct?
Correct. And also prevent this from happening.
And you said that that indicated some indication of capacity to you at that time, correct?
Correct.
And that would be before the event.
Correct.
Now, psychosis is a severe form of mental disorder that is frequently associated with a loss of contact with reality. Correct?
Yes.
Is it that experienced differently by each patient who becomes psychotic or each individual?
Yes.
And this gets to your distinction between acute psychosis or florid psychosis and otherwise psychotic. Is everyone who's psychotic or suffering from a psychotic illness babbling, homeless on the street, unable to dress themselves or carry on normal activities?
No.
Is there a whole spectrum of different types of psychosis and capabilities that individuals have?
Yes.
The fact that someone has the ability to plan in and of itself doesn't mean that they're not psychotic, does it?
It does not.
In fact, there are numerous examples of very psychotic people who are able to plan things in great detail over long periods of time. Is that right?
Correct.
It's a common misconception that people often have, that psychosis affects someone such that they cannot carry on normal daily activities and cannot plan normal parts of their life.
Well, it's a misconception that if you're psychotic, you can't. There's plenty of people who are psychotic who need structure and, won't take care of their hygiene and could never hold a job, could never go to school. So that's one end of the spectrum, but that's just one end of the spectrum. You can be psychotic and you can carry out many life functions and you can live independently.
So the fact that someone may be able to drive or go to the store or answer an email, none of that precludes someone being psychotic and being involved in a delusional process.
It does not.
Now, a thought disorder, what's a thought disorder?
A thought disorder is when your thinking is impaired, and impaired to the extent that it's psychotically impaired. And so you have different areas where your contact with reality is impaired.
So that's an aspect of psychosis then?
It's an aspect of psychosis, and you generally can see manifestations of it through speech or through writings.
Like the writings in the notebook?
Correct.
Which are disorganized?
Not all of them, but, you know, the part about his delusional thinking, I think, is quite disorganized. The part about his planning is very organized, and I would not call that's not evidence of psychotic thinking.
Understood.
But because when you have psychotic thinking, it doesn't mean in all areas of your life it's psychotic.
And let me ask you about that. And let me. I've heard an analogy to delusional psychosis that goes kind of like this. If you picture life as like a road map, the delusional psychosis is kind of like an overlay, like a transparency that lays on the map. And so the person, which may have delusional roads on it, let's just say, things that are not real. So the psychotic individual could be driving down the road, operating through life normally, and it might not be obvious to anyone because they're actually on the actual road driving normally, but then may turn off into where they perceive a road to be, where a delusion is, and may separate from reality. Does that make sense? Does that analogy make any sense? Not so much.
I'm sorry to say that it's not a great analogy description-wise, but I mean, I don't think it gives the full flavor of delusional thinking. If you talk to someone about delusional thinking, it's what they believe is that it's real. And that's the best I can tell you.
They believe it's real even though it's not.
That's correct.
And in my lame analogy, they believe that there's a road there when there really isn't a road there. And they really believe that.
Yes.
Now, in Mr. Holmes' thought disorder, that was not just limited to the human capital construct, but also included Mr. Holmes' feelings of worthlessness and his thoughts on the human worth equation as well, right?
The feelings, yes, I would say so.
So it's not just encapsulated into that one area, and you've told other folks that that's your opinion. That
yes, he didn't have, his mental illness symptom was not encapsulated. And what I mean by encapsulated, you can see people who have what's called a delusional disorder, where they clearly have a delusion, but there's no negative symptoms, there's no other symptoms related to that delusion, and they could be working, they could be presidents of corporations, and unless you talk to them specifically about that delusional thought, you would never know that anything's wrong with them. That's not the case with Mr. Holmes. Mr. Holmes had other symptoms besides his delusion, and that's what I've talked about before, is the prodromal symptoms, or those symptoms.
And that's why you disagree. And we'll talk later about how similar the various clinicians' diagnoses actually are. But that's why you disagree with Dr. Reed's diagnosis of a partial delusional disorder, correct?
Correct. And that goes sort of back to your, I think you had asked me about exclusionary diagnosis.
Yes, sir.
That for a delusional disorder, there's essentially an exclusionary diagnosis, is that you don't have other symptoms other than something that's directly related to the delusion. So if you had a delusion and you had negative symptoms, that would be exclusionary for making that diagnosis, as I understand it.
In November of 2012, is there any doubt in your mind that Mr. Holmes, when he was admitted to the hospital, Denver Health Medical Center, was both psychiatrically psychotic and suffering from some delirium as a result of not eating and drinking?
No, I don't have any question for a number of reasons. One, his delirium was indirectly precipitated by his psychosis. He developed a paranoid thought that, I believe at that time he was still on suicide precautions, and he was getting bagged lunches, and it said SS, and SS stood for suicide sack lunch. And he was paranoid and interpreted that as something to do with the Gestapo or the Nazis, and interpreted that he was being poisoned. And so he stopped eating and he stopped drinking. And he stopped eating and drinking enough that he then developed metabolic disturbances, which is the delirium. And so he got treated for the delirium and got better, but he still remained psychotic for a period of time. And it wasn't a small period of time. When you go back and look at symptoms started November 11th, and if my memory's correct, he got discharged on November 17th, and that was after he got not only his delirium adequately treated, but he got put on antipsychotic medication. So you're not talking about 2 hours or 6 hours. You're talking about at least 6 days where he had psychotic symptoms.
And the antipsychotic medication that he was prescribed, what's the purpose of that?
The purpose of antipsychotic medications is to treat the underlying psychosis. And so, meaning if you treat the underlying psychosis, you'll decrease. Sometimes you'll get rid of it, but usually it's decrease or, excuse me, or you help stabilize his condition so he can improve.
Now, in terms of florid psychoses, when on November 15th, a psychiatrist at Denver Health Medical Center, Dr. Rachel Davis, noted that the recent history had been that he had been very disorganized and definitely psychotic, sticking his finger up his anus, smearing feces, refusing to wear clothing, licking the walls, defecating on the floor, eating paper, standing on his head, talking to himself, talking without making any sense. Is this the kind of stuff that you're talking about when you talk about florid or acute psychosis?
That's what I'm talking about, florid psychosis.
He was given Haldol first at Denver Health Medical Center. What is Haldol?
Haldol is an antipsychotic medication.
As is Risperdal?
As is Risperdal.
Well, you talked about the Gmail chat with Gargi, and it was evident from the contents of the chat itself that Gargi didn't think that Mr. Holmes was making a lot of sense in that conversation. Fair to say?
Yes.
And you have some information, do you not, and I don't know where I'm remembering this, but that she may have suggested to Mr. Holmes that he see a psychiatrist. Is that right?
She had suggested to him. I'm not sure that was as a result of the Gmail chat, but she had suggested that to him.
Now, you said that it was evident at the first session with Margaret Roth, frankly, before he even saw the psychiatrist, that the stress of the homicidal ideation was expressed. Is that right?
Correct.
How long had this homicidal ideation been going on, and can you explain that to us?
Well, he reported having thoughts of killing other people for many years.
And is that one of those negative symptoms, or how does that relate?
No, I wouldn't call that a negative symptom. It's a very interesting concept. I had part of my evaluations I mentioned before is I looked at previous records, and I also talked with previous evaluators or treaters. And one of those persons was Dr. Woodcock. And so I talked with Dr. Woodcock, and I also looked at notes that Dr. Woodcock had written. And one of the things that Dr. Woodcock said is that Mr. Holmes had been struggling for many years with homicidal and suicidal thinking, and that the way he had dealt with the suicidal thinking is somehow had transferred suicidal thinking into homicidal thinking, which made him less suicidal. So I had that information going in. So then I attempted to clarify with Mr. Holmes what that process was and how it occurred, and essentially saying, how did you transfer suicidal thinking into homicidal thinking, and how was that helpful? And he couldn't explain that. And I thought that he couldn't explain it because I think he didn't understand that. And I also don't understand that. But that's the best I can tell you. He's had those thoughts for many years, and his own conceptualization was that he had homicidal thinking because he had suicidal thinking, and it was his response to deal with the suicidal thinking.
Now we've said already that we're constrained by the fact that we can't be inside someone's head at the time of the offense, and we have to infer from other things what the thought process was. Now, is that an example of how somehow that can be difficult to do, difficult to apply logic retroactively to someone who's engaged in a psychotic process at the time?
Yes.
And the danger is that we're trying to apply logic to what may be an inherently illogical thought process, potentially.
Correct.
So there may not be an answer that makes any sense.
Correct.
What's psychotic ambivalence?
Psychotic ambivalence is all of us with a lot of different issues have ambivalence. You know, should I do this or shouldn't I do this? And there's nothing psychotic about that, and there's nothing abnormal about that. What you'll see with people who demonstrate psychotic ambivalence is you'll see intense ambivalence that rapidly changes over things that they really shouldn't be ambivalent about. I mean, it could be something very simple that most people can make up their mind, you know, should I go to the store now? And they keep changing and they get distressed by it. That's what psychotic ambivalence is. And you frequently see psychotic ambivalence in people who are psychotic. You can also see ambivalence in people who are psychotic. That's not psychotic ambivalence, but just normal ambivalence.
I'm sorry.
You can also see ambivalence in people who are psychotic, in which it's not psychotic ambivalence, it's just normal ambivalence.
Now, you've spoken with Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, is that right?
Yes.
And you have no reason to doubt their observations or their conclusions that were in their notes and their record?
No, my conversations with them were consistent with their documentation.
And many of the things that they told, that Mr. Holmes told them, was consistent with what he told you and other clinicians after the fact, right?
Yes.
Long-standing thoughts of killing people. He went right in and told them that, right?
Correct.
And we've talked about, counsel's talked about some of the things that he didn't tell them. But there were certainly a lot of things that he did tell them. Fair to say?
Yes.
He went in right off the bat and said he had thoughts of killing a lot of people. Is that right?
Correct.
And Dr. Fenton recognized pretty early on what she identified as probable psychotic thinking. Is that right?
Yes.
I'm thinking specifically at first about him having to get glasses and portraying that to her as a betrayal of his biology. And she saw that as probable psychotic thinking in that it had a very bizarre quality. Is that right?
Yes, let me just clarify. I previously talked about differential diagnosis. Early on, Dr. Fenton, in her differential diagnosis, included high on her list that this was a psychotic presentation. So yes, she considered that.
And later on, she continued to talk about how this may be a frank psychotic disorder, such as schizophrenia. Is that right?
Correct. I don't think she ever ruled out that he was psychotic. I think it continued as a potential potential description as of her June 11th discharge note.
And you see some potentially psychotic thinking in some of those statements that were made to her as well. Is that right?
Yes.
How about the glasses thing? Is that a somatic delusion of some kind, or?
You know, the glasses thing I would consider, if I was in her shoes, not necessarily psychotic, but bizarre. And when you start seeing things that are bizarre, you begin to think that maybe this is a psychotic process. But by itself, you don't say it's psychotic. But it certainly raised the index of suspicion for Dr. Fenton.
How about the whole session where she thought Dr. Fenton had locked the door and had some kind of secret box behind her desk that she was hiding from him? Do you recall that?
Yes, and again, that would make you certainly think of paranoid thinking, and when you start thinking of paranoid thinking, you think of psychosis, and then if you have other kinds of bizarre behavior, that makes you think more strongly of psychosis.
Common for people suffering from schizophrenia to describe their past delusions or motivations somewhat differently over time, especially after they're medicated. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement.
If I may have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
Now, 5 days before the Gmail chat with Gargi on the 25th of March, 2012, Mr. Holmes goes to see Dr. Fenton and she puts him on sertraline, correct?
Yes.
What's sertraline?
Sertraline is an antidepressant medication, but it's not just used for depression. It's also used for anxiety disorders. It's also used for obsessive compulsive disorders.
Is that like a generic term for Zoloft? Or?
It is.
So he gets put on Zoloft or sertraline. Let me ask you, if you give, and it's your opinion at that point in time that Mr. Holmes was suffering from a depression, right?
Correct.
A clinical depression.
Correct.
Such that he meets the criteria for a major depressive disorder.
If you, and that, yes, and that's based on what he told me and based on his notebook. And I'll just add that that wasn't told to Dr. Fenton.
Indeed, indeed. Now,
Wasn't me.
was it?
I deny it as well.
I'm going to blame it on somebody in the gallery.
Mr. Ingalls raising his hand.
And we talked before about mania versus depression and how that can work. Now, it's known in the literature, the psychiatric literature, sir, that if you have someone who's suffering from a depression, a clinical depression such as you described, major depressive disorder, and you give them an SSRI, like sertraline or Zoloft, it can flip them into mania, can it not?
Well, not exactly. If all you have is a depressive disorder and you get treated with antidepressants, that will not flip you into mania. If you have a bipolar disorder or a form of bipolar disorder in which you can have depression and mania, that a certain percentage of people with that kind of disorder, if you give them antidepressants, it can flip you into having manic symptoms.
And that's the kind of disorder that you've diagnosed Mr. Holmes as having as part of the schizoaffective disorder, is that right?
That's correct.
Bipolar disorder that had both manic and depressive features.
Correct.
So it's certainly possible that by getting that medication, it threw him into a mania. Is that right?
It's possible when you look at the symptoms that he described in his notebook, which included some manic symptoms, and what he labeled as his dysphoric mania.
Right.
It's possible that the Zoloft could have caused that. But let me also tell you what I'm not saying. I don't think his delusional belief was related to that medication, and I don't think his subsequent actions were related to that medication. I think his actions were related to the delusion, not to the medication.
And the delusion was related to the psychosis of the underlying disorder.
That's
and
correct.
not the medication.
That's correct.
The symptoms of mania, however, may have been exacerbated by the medication. Fair to say?
The history he gave me is that he did not have manic symptoms until he got on that medication. And then once he got on that medication, by the notebook, there's what looks like manic symptoms. And then he got off the Zoloft, and those symptoms went away.
So it seems like that may have played a part in some way.
It may have played a part. I don't think it's a significant part, but it may have played a part.
And he wrote in the notebook, did he not, that after receiving the medication that he lost the fear of other people and lost the, do you remember those writings?
Correct.
And it was then, or later on actually, that he wrote that text message to the young woman in his class, Hillary. Is that right?
Yes, that was much later on.
In July.
We're talking about July. And
Early July.
He had been off Zoloft for sertraline for some period of time.
Do you know when he stopped taking the Zoloft for sure or no?
Well, I do when I look at, I think it's in Dr. Fenton's notes. I don't recall the exact date. I'd have to look at that.
Do you know how many pills were found in his apartment?
I know pills were found. I don't recall how many.
And in that text message, he says, I could have one moment, Your Honor. I'd like to mark this as defense exhibit. D-PT-56, I think, Your Honor.
I think you mean D-TR-56.
TR. I'll show it to counsel.
Okay. Mr. King, you may want to turn your microphone on. Okay.
I don't have an objection to the exhibit.
All right, Mr. King, are you moving its admission?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, without objection, D-TR-56 is admitted and may be published.
First 1448. Approach the witness with this.
You may, and you can turn your mic back on, too.
Is that the text message you're referring to, sir?
It is.
On the first page there, and there's some overlap between the three. It looks like this is taken right directly from someone's phone. Is that what it looks like to you?
Yes.
And can you see about halfway down there where it says, have you ever met someone with dysphoric mania?
Yes.
And to your understanding, is that Mr. Holmes texting on the left-hand side and Hillary texting on the right-hand side?
Yes.
And Hillary says, no, what is that? And he says, it's what I've got. And can we have the next page? Anyways, it's in your best interest to avoid me, and bad news bears. See that?
Yes.
And then she says, I just looked it up. Is it manageable? I've struggled with depression too. Comes from other stuff it's hard to deal with. And in response to the is it manageable question, he says, it was, floodgates open now. Correct?
Correct.
If we have the third page. It says, are you okay? I'm not scared of that stuff, but I can understand. And he says, yup. What significance did that text message have for your determination, sir?
Well, there's all different significance, but let me start with the first. As I've already testified, I thought that he had a significant depression. And I think this describes a significant depression in the context of all the other stuff that I've gathered. The other thing that this helped me formulate, one of the questions I had to try to answer is, if he's had this homicidal thinking for this long, one question is, why is he acting on it now? And you can also ask the question, well, if he's had this delusional thinking this long, why didn't he act on it in April? Why did he wait till July? And this, along with other questioning, helped me answer that question. And so he didn't act on it, and he says in the Gargi March 25th chat why he didn't act on it is because he would get arrested. And that's why he didn't act on it, because he didn't want to get arrested and go to prison. So why is that not a deterrence now? I think the reason it wasn't a deterrence by July is his depression. Having a major depressive disorder is an extremely unpleasant experience for most people. It's a painful experience. And I think he was significantly depressed, and so depressed that, and what he essentially told me, that acting on this belief that if I kill people, I will feel better, that going to jail didn't look so painful as how he felt not acting on that belief. So he felt so depressed that he was willing to do anything that would make him feel less depressed, even if it was going to end up in jail. And I think that's what he's saying here is, in many ways, he had some coping mechanisms before to deal with the depression. And part of those coping mechanisms is, people feel feel better about themselves generally through their love and their work. And for him, work was school. And so he failed at school. He failed at his relationship. And those coping mechanisms weren't helping him with feeling better. And I think that's what he means when he says the floodgates are open. There's no way of shutting the floodgates again to at least make him feel less painful. So that's my understanding from talking with him about this.
You can take that down, man. Thank you. You were asked some questions about whether or not Mr. Holmes ever told you that he felt like he was possessed by some higher power or something along those lines. By a, do you remember that line of questioning from Mr. Brockler?
I do.
Said he remembered the question. So.
Overruled.
Do you remember Mr. Holmes talking to you about the selfie photos that he took with the black contact lenses?
I do.
Do you remember him saying to you that these lenses had a feeling, quote, like I'm possessed, just felt right, possessed in some manner, like I had to go through with it?
Correct.
Now, you said that you ruled out dissociative identity disorder as part of your differential diagnosis. Is that right?
Correct.
And that used to be what was called multiple personality disorder?
Correct.
The civil thing?
Correct.
Now, in terms of malingering, would that have been a perfect opportunity to malinger if Mr. Holmes had wanted to do so?
Yes.
Why?
Because what he could have said is, I don't remember doing any of this. It was a part of me that I don't know about. And then that would have led to a whole different series of kinds of questions. And the reason I say that, back in the 1980s, when it was still called multiple personality disorder, it was sort of in vogue, not both by, there was a group of clinicians who suddenly were diagnosing multiple personality disorder in a huge percentage of people
that was you? Or
pardon me?
That was you that was diagnosing the most? No, I'm joking.
Yeah, that was not me. Yeah, but as a result of that, there were a lot of people in criminal court pleading NGRI based on MPD, multiple personality disorder. And so I've been through that before about trying to rule out malingering, because it's very easy to say, I don't remember and it was someone else. That's, and it was not infrequently done. Mr. Holmes didn't do that.
And yeah, Mr. Holmes
And I gave him plenty of opportunity to do that, and he did not do that.
He refused to just blame it on another part of himself or something like that. Fair to say?
Correct, and he didn't claim memory loss. That's correct.
But he did talk about his normal self being distinct from his crazy self, though. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And when you asked him you know, how does that work? He was unable to say why that was important to him, right?
Correct.
There were no gaps, though, in his recall of the day of events that would suggest that he was becoming another person at different times, and then didn't remember large portions of.
There was. That's correct. He does not meet the criteria for dissociative identity disorder.
Now, you did note in your report, however, that there were symptoms of depersonalization. For example, experiences of detachment, distorted sense of self, emotional and or physical numbing that appeared to be present during the time surrounding the alleged crime. Is that right?
Correct.
I want to just follow up a little bit on malingering. In order to have been malingering his mental illness, Mr. Holmes would have to have been malingering with Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, right?
Among others.
With Gargi in the chat in March, right?
Correct.
When he applied to the University of Iowa.
Correct.
So we see evidence that shows that he's not feigning. It goes way back in time, prior to even the development of the delusion that caused the shooting, right?
Correct.
Now, would you agree with me that if someone is going to malingo their symptoms, they're going to exaggerate their symptoms, and there's certainly some indication at times that Mr. Holmes seems to minimize his symptoms?
Correct.
Is that something that people with mental illness do, is minimize their symptoms?
It's very common that people with serious mental illness minimize their symptoms. And the reason they do that is no one likes to not have their brain working correctly. Most people don't like having medical illnesses. So, I mean, it's not unusual. You see someone who has a heart attack who had symptoms a day before, and they denied that they had symptoms consistent with a heart attack, because who wants to have a heart attack? Well, it's very similar to having a mental illness. There's a tremendous stigma in this country associated with having serious mental illness, in addition to it being very unpleasant to have a serious mental illness. So people's psychological coping is generally to deny that you have such symptoms.
Any indication to you that Mr. Holmes' mental illness is a pleasant experience for him, either in the past or currently?
No. There's no indication that it's been a pleasant experience for him. There's plenty of indications that it's been a disturbing, distressing experience for him.
Both before the shooting and subsequently?
Correct.
Now, on the psychological testing that was done of Mr. Holmes, that testing revealed that he wasn't malingering, number one, right?
It was consistent with him not malingering.
It revealed as well that there was some significant psychological disturbance in the testing itself.
Correct. It was consistent with having a psychotic illness. It was also consistent with having a depressive illness as well. So as a bottom line, it's
very clear to you that Mr. Holmes suffers from a chronic and serious mental illness associated with psychotic features, yes?
That's an answer, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Yes.
And the symptoms of that illness have included the following: delusions, hallucinations, catatonic behavior, negative symptoms. True?
True, and now I just want to be clear, when you're talking about hallucinations, I'm not just talking about pre-July 20. I'm talking about November 17 and before.
Understood. Negative symptoms including diminished emotional expression, lack of motivation, diminished speech output, lack of interest in social interactions, and decreased ability to experience pleasure. True?
Correct.
A marked decrease in his level of functioning
Correct.
across numerous areas of his life.
Yes.
Manic-like symptoms.
Correct, and I think in my report I said manic-like symptoms by history.
You did, as a matter of fact. Thank you for correcting me. And by history, you mean reported in the notebook as having happened in early 2012.
Reported in the notebook and reported by him. That's what I mean by history.
Obsessive compulsive behaviors,
Correct.
chronic suicidal and homicidal thinking.
Correct.
Based upon everything that you've seen, it's very clear to you that the tragic and horrible shooting spree on July 20th was a direct result of Mr. Holmes' illness. Is that right?
Correct.
And without that mental illness, the shooting would never have taken place.
That is my opinion.
What's concrete thinking?
Concrete thinking is to be contrasted with abstract thinking. So, for example, if I ask you to tell me people in glass houses should not throw stones, if you have an example of abstract thinking and I say, what does that mean? Abstract thinking would say, well, you shouldn't be critical of other people if you have the same faults. Concrete thinking would be, you shouldn't throw stones in a glass house because you'll break the glass. So that's what concrete thinking is.
Mr. Holmes displayed evidence of concrete thinking,
Correct.
and that's a sign of schizophrenia, is it not?
It's consistent with schizophrenia.
Or schizoaffective disorder.
With a lot of other illnesses, but also with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. And you can also have concrete thinking and not be mentally ill. So I don't want people to think that if they have concrete thinking, that's a sign of mental illness.
Not necessarily, but
Correct.
it can be.
It can be, but because you have it doesn't mean you have a mental illness.
Now I want to talk a little bit about nihilistic philosophy and philosophy in general. Can we do that?
I guess we're going to.
There's been some talk about how, and you heard Dr. Reed's testimony about how Mr. Holmes had the belief in moral relativism, or what could be called nihilism. Let me ask you this. Can somebody believe in moral relativism and still be mentally ill and psychotic?
Yes.
Isn't it true that many times people's psychosis or delusions incorporate aspects of religion or philosophy into the delusional construct?
Correct.
For
It's not-
example,
it's not restricted to either religion or philosophy, but correct.
could be anything, right?
That's correct.
Like I think I'm Jesus Christ, for example, would be a delusion you mentioned before, right?
Correct.
That would be related to religion in some fashion, right?
Correct.
And so the fact that Mr. Holmes may have a belief in moral relativism does not mean that his thought process was not psychotic, does it?
Correct.
Whether or not he believes in moral relativism or not is irrelevant to whether the thought process is psychotic. I mean, it could be either way.
Correct.
You were asked about whether you saw Mr. Holmes react emotionally when you talked to him, and you did not, did you?
Correct.
Now, you were the third psychiatrist to see him, is that right?
Probably more than that. Before my seeing him, there was Dr. Woodcock, there was Dr. Gurr, there was Dr. Mosier.
The folks at the hospital, in some sense.
Dr. Pounds admitted him, so I was probably the fifth psychiatrist. I was the third psychiatrist I was actually the second psychiatrist who really talked to him about the alleged crimes.
The more that you see people, the more their reactions can change, especially when someone is medicated, right?
Yeah, I would say more, not so much the more you see people. I think that when you're talking about emotionally charged issues, probably you're going to see the most emotion related to those issues the first time you talk about it. I think when you talk about it the second time, you're not going to have the same, necessarily going to have the same emotional reaction.
Now, there's been some talk about whether Mr. Holmes was seeking to be remembered or some kind of notoriety or something along those lines. It's your opinion that the pursuit of notoriety was not, in this case, the basis for the shooting.
That's correct.
Now, with regard to psychotic ambivalence, it is psychotic ambivalence that caused Mr. Holmes to go to the psychiatrist, tell the psychiatrist he was going to kill a bunch of people, and then withhold further information because he was psychotic, right?
I don't know if that was psychotic ambivalence. I think it certainly was ambivalence. I'm not sure that the reason I'm saying I don't think it was psychotic ambivalence is I think if it was psychotic ambivalence, he would have been more likely to tell him and then next day not tell him. And I think it was just ambivalence.
Do you remember testifying in this case before, sir?
I do.
You recall testifying in the afternoon of January 30, 2014.
I do.
Counsel, I direct your attention to page 68 into 69. What's that? Sure. Do you recall this question and answer? And I'll give you a chance to clarify if you want. Okay, so if you go to a psychiatrist and you tell the psychiatrist, I'm thinking about killing a bunch of people, why would you then withhold further information from her? Answer, well, I can actually answer that because we talked about it, okay? And because he was psychotic. And part of psychosis is you frequently see ambivalence. It's not all one way or the other. And one of the things he told me on one hand, he wanted to be hospitalized. And on at least one occasion, and I think more than one occasion, he was giving answers such as, if I told you that, you would hospitalize me. And then on the other hand, he had the delusional belief that he wanted to act on, and if he was stopped, if he was hospitalized, he was not going to be able to do that. So that's an example of ambivalence and psychosis. Do you remember those questions and
Yes.
answers, sir?
I don't think that's inconsistent with what I just said. What I said in that testimony is it was an example of ambivalence and psychosis. What I didn't say is that's an example of psychotic ambivalence. And I think on balance that, so that I stand by what I'm saying now.
Okay. Now, it's not uncommon for schizophrenic people to describe delusions somewhat differently over time as they become medicated. You said that. And the reason is that they may describe delusions differently because medication can change the underlying process that led to the delusion in the first place. Correct?
Correct.
They may also describe delusions differently because of protective reasons. Can you explain that?
That, again, goes back to not wanting to think that your brain's not working well. And if you begin to think about a particular thought process, you could change that because that particular thought process is too disturbing for you to come to terms with. And so you could change it as a protective psychological mechanism.
At some point, Mr. Holmes told you that the thoughts that he had about the homicidal thoughts that he had, after he expressed them to Ms. Tagargi in that Gmail chat in March, that they became more real because they existed outside his thoughts. Having spoken these thoughts led to an action regarding these thoughts. You recall that?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
I can't rationally explain that. I think that's part of his psychosis. I mean, that the fact that he spoke out loud and shared this delusional thinking, he somehow made it more real to him, I think is psychotically based. I can't give you a rational explanation of why that would happen.
Now, he described later on that this was an inevitability, something that he had no choice about doing, he felt, something he was obligated to do. Fair to say?
You'll have to refer me to my report where I say that, because I'm not sure that I have that information from my examination that it was inevitable.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. You were asked about whether he used the phrase call to action, I think. Do you recall that question?
Correct.
He did say to you that once the thoughts were more real, having spoken them led to an action regarding those thoughts. Correct?
He did say that. That's correct.
All right. I'm almost done. I want to ask you a little bit about your treatment of prong 2, or capacity, if I might. Now, in your analysis of capacity, you noted in your report that you used the societal standard of morality in determining, when it came to the issue of ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Is that correct?
Yes,
That's your understanding of the test in the state of Colorado.
correct.
Your understanding of the test in the state of Colorado is that someone may be insane under the law, despite the fact that they know that their actions are legally wrong or against the law, correct?
Correct.
You listed a number of factors in your analysis of what was significant to you. Now, you believe, it's your strong contention that he legally knew quite clearly that what he was doing was against the law, correct?
Yes.
The issue of morals was a little bit more gray for you. Fair to say?
Well, as I said in direct, it was more difficult for me because I had problems obtaining information from Mr. Holmes because of the nature of his illness.
Okay.
Once I obtained that information, then it wasn't a difficult assessment for me.
And the assessment was that he was able to have the capacity to distinguish the wrongfulness of his actions.
Yes.
It's also very clear that his appreciation for the wrongfulness of his actions was impaired from a clinical perspective as a result of his psychotic thinking, correct?
Right, and the reason I said from a clinical perspective is I was using the term impaired or impairment, not using a legal definition, which is a different definition. I was using it from a clinical perspective, that his judgment was impaired.
Now, there are circumstances, are there not, where society considers it morally right to kill.
Correct.
During wartime,
Yes.
to prevent larger disasters or when someone's life is threatened.
Correct.
So being part of being able to distinguish whether something is right or wrong is understanding the context in which that is made. Is that fair to say?
Certainly in terms of war or self-defense, that's fair to say.
The terrorist who conducts a mass shooting for political reasons and is not mentally ill, we would all agree that that person is morally wrong from a societal perspective.
Correct.
But the person themselves, the terrorist, might consider that it's the morally right thing to do if they really believe in their cause. Fair to
Correct.
say? And that's why it can get a little tough, because we're combining law and medicine and morality together in one place. Fair to say?
Okay. The objection is overruled, but Mr. King, you must proceed as we discussed at the bench.
For someone who has their microphone on. For someone who is psychotic, the context in which we have to evaluate their ability to distinguish right from wrong includes their psychosis, right?
Yes.
The thought disorder and the delusional thinking, right?
Correct.
The paranoia and the impaired judgment.
Yes.
Reality for that person is colored by the thought disorder they're suffering from.
That's
Right.
also correct.
We know, as we sit here today, that it's morally wrong to kill, right?
Correct.
But the question for the psychotic person is, at the time, perceiving and understanding the world through their thought disorder, did they have the capacity to understand what was right and wrong?
That is the question.
When a person is psychotic, their decision-making and their thinking is affected by their psychosis.
Correct.
And you give an analogy to drunk driving when we've talked, when it comes to capability. Is that right?
Correct.
Can you describe that analogy for the jury?
Yes. You could be intoxicated and know that it's illegal to drive while you're drunk. And you can also know that it's morally wrong by societal standards to drive while you're drunk, because you could injure people. But because your judgment is impaired by your intoxication, you could say I don't care, or you could say it's not going to happen, and so your judgment would be impaired, and you would still drive. And the context that I gave that analogy is when I said that in my report that I thought Mr. Holmes' judgment was clinically impaired And that's why he did what he did, despite knowing the difference, in my opinion, despite having the capacity to know the difference between right from wrong. He still did it because he had impaired judgment. And as I said before, an example of his impaired judgment in my mind was that it was much better for him to go out and do this in order to increase his self-worth and feel better than it was to not do this and feel as bad as he did. And that it was worth the risk of him going to jail because of how he felt. And all that is example of psychotically impaired thinking.
Now, insanity is a recognized offense here in Colorado. Is that right?
Correct.
For any specific intent crime, right?
Correct.
Is voluntary intoxication a defense to drunk driving anywhere?
Not that I'm aware of.
Is someone who's drunk ever insane? Or would that be specifically precluded by the statute?
Well, it's precluded if the cause of your assuming that you lack the capacity, if the cause of your lacking the capacity is because you're drunk. I imagine you could have lost so that's my answer, to make it clean.
Someone who is drunk doesn't have persistent delusional beliefs, do they?
Correct.
If I'm drunk and I'm going to drive, this is the first part of your analogy, does that imply that the person is making a rational choice despite their impaired judgment? In other words, they know that what they're doing is wrong. They're thinking in a rational way about that, but their judgment is impaired such that they don't care, or they're rationalizing and justifying their behavior.
And would you please repeat your question?
The question is, if I'm drunk and going to drive, does that imply that that person is making a rational choice?
No, it doesn't.
Turn on your mic.
I'm going to object to the relevance of the drunk driver. Further discussion.
Sustained.
Okay. The factors that you pointed to, sir, that you relied on in making your determination of capacity were, first of all, the content of the Gmail chat with Gargi. Is that right?
Correct.
And that took place in March. Is that right?
Yes.
So you're inferring by what he said in March that he could distinguish between right or wrong in July. That's the inference.
No, that's not the inference. If it turned out that my opinion was he lacked capacity in March, that would be important information. The fact that he didn't lack that, in my opinion, that he had capacity in March is a point in time. And I couldn't generalize what he had in July based on what he had in March, but it's a point in time that's useful information.
So it's something that you can infer from.
The reason that that's important is part of my diagnostic thinking is that in my opinion, he was psychotic in March. And in my opinion, in March, he had capacity to tell the difference between right from wrong. And I wanted subsequent questioning to see if anything changed. Did his illness change that changed his capacity? So that's really the significance.
That he had the ability in March to distinguish between right or wrong, and from that, absent some change, you're inferring that that was the same state of mind he had in July.
That's fair.
Same is true of his statements to Drs. Fenton and Feinstein. That's closer in time to July than March, for the most part, correct?
Yes.
But again, it's a point in time whereby you can then infer that he knew the difference between right or wrong, had the capacity to at that point, and absent something contradictory, you're saying that he did in July as well.
Yeah, what I'm saying is the closer you can get to time, the more, probably the more important the assessment is. So, for example, opining that at the age of 16 he had the capacity doesn't mean much. It means a fair amount when you can opine that at the onset of his psychosis he had the capacity, and it means something when in the same month of the alleged crimes he had the capacity. And then it means a lot when you can say immediately prior to the shooting he had the capacity. It means a lot.
And those things all can mean something, but they are not dispositive of what was going on in his mind as the shooting took place, correct?
It's not 100% dispositive. It gets pretty close.
You said that one of the things that you considered was the fact that he didn't reveal his planned actions to Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, right?
Correct.
And by that you infer that he knew that what he was doing was going to be wrong, or what he was planning to do was wrong.
Correct.
And that could certainly be true in a legal sense, that he may have thought that it was legally wrong and he didn't want to tell them because he would have been stopped from doing what he was doing.
That's a possibility.
That doesn't preclude the fact that he thought it was morally right.
That fact by itself, I would not have rendered that opinion based only on that.
And if he had told Dr. Fenton and Feinstein exactly what he had planned to do, that would have also suggested to you that he had the capability to distinguish between right or wrong. Right? Why would he not tell them if it wasn't wrong?
Let me just think about your question again. If he had told him, that would have meant that he could distinguish the difference between right from wrong, is your question.
As well, yes.
That's, again, a possibility.
You brought up the fact that after the shooting, Mr. Holmes didn't attempt to escape or didn't attempt to leave or drive off, but just waited there because he knew he was going to be arrested.
Correct.
Again, a sign that he knew what he was doing was legally wrong, for sure.
Yes.
And by that you infer perhaps morally, right?
Yeah, I infer more than just perhaps. Yeah, I think that that was an indication for me that he knew it was morally wrong as well.
If he had jumped in his car and sped away and led the police on a high-speed chase, that would have also created an inference for you that he knew what he was doing was wrong as well, right?
Correct. However, if he had jumped in his car and drove normally, as if nothing he did was wrong, would create a different inference for me.
If he jumped in his car and tried to drive casually away as if nothing had happened, that wouldn't create an inference that he was trying to get away because he knew what he was doing was wrong?
Well, that would then require further questioning of him of why did you drive casually?
If he'd shot the police officers, that would have been an indication to you that he thought what he was doing was wrong.
Again, it would be, if he shot the police officers, I would need to talk to him about why he shot the police officers before I made that judgment.
And if he attempted to run away on foot, that would have been an indication to you that he knew what he was doing was wrong as well.
Correct.
I have 1 minute, Your Honor.
Yes.
With regard to your opinion, sir, that the cause of the shooting was the mental illness, you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
All right, Mr. Brockler, do you have any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Dr. Messer, in light of all of the stuff that Mr. King just went through with you and all the different possibilities from suggesting that something else was to blame for it or something else could have caused it, or all these different scenarios, including the drunk driving one, has your opinion changed one whit that this guy right here had the capacity to know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality when he walked into that theater on the 19th and 20th and tried to murder the theater full of people?
It has not changed.
You still extremely confident in it?
Yes.
How about the other prong? Anything about what Mr. King brought up to you or threw out as possibilities that changes your extreme confidence in your previously stated opinion that this guy had the capacity to form the intent to murder after deliberation and to act knowingly with regard to all the other alleged criminal conduct?
My opinion hasn't changed and my degree of confidence hasn't
In
changed.
fact, had you considered all of the things that Mr. King had just brought up in cross-examination in formulating your expert opinion on the matter of sanity?
I believe so.
There was something that you said right towards the end, and then we'll back up to where Mr. King started. You had said with regards to trying to figure out what his capacity was on July the 19th and 20th, you said it's not 100%, but it's close. What did you mean by that?
I'm trying to think of the context of the exact question that I was responding to. I think the question was, one of the factors that the context was what was going on in his mind immediately prior to the shooting. And one of the factors I talked about, there was actually two of the factors that I previously talked about. One was the telephone call to the University of Colorado. The second one was putting on the headphones and wanting this to be impersonal, not wanting it to be personal. That's about the closest you can get to what his state of mind was without being in the theater and interviewing him as he's shooting. And so that's why I say it's not 100%, but it doesn't get much closer to getting that kind of information.
Some of the other things that you had brought up before, though, took place either during or shortly after. Do you recall one of the prongs you talked about was his reference afterwards to whether he had killed any children.
Correct. And so that was pretty soon after the shooting as well.
We had evidence presented that he sent the notebook maybe that night before. Also, you had indicated that the mailing of that notebook fed into your thoughts about his capacity to know right from wrong based on the societal standards of morality.
Objection leading, asked and answered.
I'll sustain us to leading. So sustain us to this being a leading question, overruled as to asked and answered. You can rephrase the question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, let me do that since that got sustained. How did the mailing of the notebook impact you in terms of your analysis of capacity and the timing related to when this shooting took place?
Well, it was the day before the shooting, and the stated reason, which was consistent in my mind with a lot of the contents of the notebook, the stated reason was to educate psychiatrists in the future so they can prevent this from happening. Well, if he had the capacity, if he lacked the capacity to tell the difference between right from wrong, there would be no reason to educate psychiatrists about doing something that he thought was right.
There was another portion of the exchange here towards the end where you were confronted with other hypothetical facts from this. For instance, had the defendant actually made an assessment that he could get away and had driven away, how would that impact? Do you recall that exchange?
Yes.
I want to give you a different hypothetical that touches upon that. If you had a hypothetical where the defendant on the same day goes to a gun store, purchases an AR-15, buys ammunition, carries it out in broad daylight, walks across the parking lot to, let's say, a theater, walks in broad daylight, does nothing to be surreptitious or cover up what his plans are, goes and even gets a Coke to drink, walks into the theater and starts shooting folks from that regard. Are those facts distinguishable enough from these that they begin to suggest that maybe this guy doesn't know right from wrong on a societal standard of morality?
They would be.
When you are considering this crime, are you focused on one, two, or three things, or do you look at a global perspective of all the decisions that were made by that guy right there?
You look at the totality of the circumstances, so it's not based on just one factor.
And I want to make sure that I'm clear on this too. We keep saying psychotic and psychosis, and those are the right terms, I get that. But they all flow from the delusion, is that right?
Yes.
And I want to make sure I know what the delusion is. Is the delusion that he thought he would feel better and his value would increase the more people he killed?
The delusion was that he would increase his self-worth by killing people. And a secondary thought he had about that is that this would help him become less depressed. So there are really two aspects of it.
Is it accurate or fair to conclude that the defendant then made a decision to substitute human lives for his increased self-worth and feeling better?
Objection. Calls for an improper opinion.
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir.
I think that's accurate.
Mr. Bruckler, I think today is a day when we have to stop at 5. One of the jurors has to leave at 5 and told my staff, and so we're going to have to adjourn. Doctor, can you return tomorrow?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm being told that the juror does not have to leave at 5 today. All right. So then let me ask all the jurors: is there anyone on the jury who cannot stay past 5? No, Mr. Bruckler. How long do you think you have on your redirect? Oh, not super long time. That's why I was asking how long you think it's going to take you.
I think it would take me just in excess, more than 15 minutes. I don't know what a short time is, but...
In that case, we'll just stop then. I think it makes sense to just stop. Are you okay coming back tomorrow, Doctor?
Yes.
All right. All right, members of the jury, we're going to go ahead and adjourn for the day. Please keep in mind all my advisements that I've been giving you with respect to your conduct when you're not here, all of them apply tonight. Have a good evening. Get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Everyone may be seated. Dr. Metzner, are you okay coming back tomorrow morning?
Yes, I have a question for you. Am I okay in making plain reservations to leave the state on Wednesday morning?
Yes, we should be. I don't see how we don't get done with you by tomorrow.
Okay, I'm okay coming back.
If Mr. Brockler goes on with his redirect until Wednesday, I will stop him.
Thank you.
So you can make reservations.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And you're free to leave, by the way. And by the way, I wanted to let counsel know that the reason why I decided to just adjourn for the day is one of the jurors indicated that she needed a restroom break. And so it was going to take us at least 10 more minutes to do that. My court reporter hasn't had a break for a couple of hours, and I'm sure she needs a break. And so I just decided it was best to just adjourn for the day. In terms of the emails that we talked about, when tomorrow are you thinking that you're gonna that they're gonna come up?
Actually, and I don't know if you're on a notice, me sort of standing a second ago, because I learned while Dr. Metzner was testifying some new information, and I do not believe that witness is available tomorrow, so I think it will be Wednesday.
Okay, great. Okay, that gives us some time, and so I'll pick a time tomorrow when it makes sense for me to make a ruling on that exhibit. And by the way, I did notice when you were standing up, Mr. Orman, although that doesn't always communicate to me, what I think it should. So I'm glad that you told me what it is you wanted to talk about. Is there anything else on behalf of the people at this time? Is there anything? Oh, Ms. Tish McGuire?
Thanks, Your Honor. Your Honor had issued an order about victim impact videos, and from my understanding of the court's order, it seems like you just wanted me to discover the new videos to the defense if they have objections to raise that with the court, but I wanted to double check and see if the court wanted copies of those by Wednesday as well.
No, not necessarily. Just discover them to the defense, and then I'm sure Ms. Nelson will raise the issue if she thinks there is an issue for her to raise. She can do it orally.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anything on behalf of the defense at this time? Mr. King, do you have anything?
No, I don't, Your Honor. I think Ms. Nelson may have something, though.
No, she's saying no.
No, we're just trying to sort out what should become court exhibits. I'll get back to the court about that in the morning if we have some things to submit.
Okay. Yeah, I talked to my staff. There was one exhibit that was admitted, I thought it was, and it was displayed, and then there was another one that was just displayed. If you want to mark that as a court exhibit, we can do that. You did not offer it into evidence, you just displayed it, and I think appropriately. So the prosecution has done the same thing with other parts of the DSM-5, and I don't know whether the prosecution has marked those as court exhibits. Have you marked those pages or portions of the DSM-5 that you've used as court exhibits?
Not, Your Honor, because I actually had it come right out of the DSM-5.
And so did the defense, and so I'm not concerned about marking it, because I'm pretty sure that no matter when in the future this may be reviewed, somebody will be able to get a hold of the DSM-5 and figure out what excerpt was read and talked about, and given the record, I think it's clear what was talked about. So, but I'll leave it up to you, Ms. Nelson. If you want to mark it, just let my staff know, okay? All right, the court will be in recess. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.